This is our mic.
Our mic.
Yeah, microphone for the stream.
I'm taking notes. I'll click my phone on record.
You can teach us all.
I'm taking notes. Got a buddy of mine who just joined the 40th Snow Club the other day. He went nuts.
Down there or here?
No, up here. Yeah, he called me though down there. I was out on the boat. I was going out, got the message. Sent me the picture, 41 and a half. I'm like, I said, I've been fishing for 30 years. I finally got one.
It took me a while.
Yeah.
Then I figured them out.
Right. You got a lot of them now fire, right? A lot of your big boys.
Yeah, springtime, there's always a lot of good spots, but the falls, when I really like them, because they come in that river following the shad. Grouper rods with 8-ounce sinkers.
What the hell's the heat?
I had somebody tell me one time, that ain't no fun, just horse them in. I
Go
said,
ahead.
you get 1 of 5,
Right.
because the rest of them can pull 100
Yeah.
pound to a pile.
food must be good. Nobody's talking anymore. Hey there. Full speed ahead.
That's good.
Awesome. Love it.
Just always something.
Got 74 people watching.
We're ready?
Yeah.
All
All right. There we go.
Oh, I when you said higher.
You got a couple spots up front. Everyone sit, try to fill the chairs you got.
That was close.
He's starting already. Terry's worried.
People are showing up. People are coming.
So she
So
wanted you to point it.
You're good. It's right there.
I
think they're going to be trouble.
It's right there.
Are y'all Hubbard regulars?
Yeah, I do everything, fresh water,
recognize
salt
you
water.
guys for perfection.
Mike, try to open this thing. So, as we always do, so I guess it's always on it, but as we always do, first and foremost, I want to thank the good people here at Bartow for putting this together. Those of you that had some food, Silver Inn Cafe in Riverview there, not too bad, yeah? Food's okay? Okay, all right. I always say this, if you're out and about, you have to be there in Riverview. It's on US 301 right there, just before the Alpine River on the right-hand side. If you're hungry, stop by, get you a Cuban, and tell them you love them and appreciate them doing this. Dana had said she heard about this thing for the last 2-3 weeks already, so those of you that do go by there, I appreciate it. We got some super guests tonight, two of my favorites in the business. Both of them are just great fishermen, so if you have other questions, that's fine. But they're both really, really exceptional offshore fishermen. So don't be afraid to ask questions, beat them up, give them a hard time, all that good stuff. Make sure at some point everybody signs in. We got some great goodies to give away, so you don't need to ask her. I didn't say time for a question.
I see. Robert, what was the other thing?
The one with the ankle bracelet.
That's why we have to switch it from 6 to 8. My probation doesn't
It's a very good point. So without further ado, the great Captain Dylan Hubbard, D. Hubbs, and Mike Mahoney asking some questions.
You're first.
I'm first. You guys are first. It's a fishing conversation, so the whole point is hopefully you guys have some questions for us, and that way we're not standing up here talking at you instead talking with you. So does anybody have any questions to kick it off? Well, we'll start by just talking about what's going on now. I know you were just on a trip doing your full moon. You're really kind of dialed into those moon phases, and you're a big believer in that full moon, huh?
Well, when I first, my first blue marlin was down in St. Thomas. I went with a friend of mine I knew nothing about. It's probably 5 years ago. And he said, we're going on the full moon in June. And I said, is that the best time? He said, June and July down in St. Thomas on the full moon are always going to be great pelagic weeks. So I used to fish offshore here. In the full moon, I just wouldn't fish. I really wasn't a fan of bottom fishing on the full moon. They kind of hit like they got sore mouths. They don't really nail it hard that you're used to when you're grouper fishing. So I started, once I realized that, and we had great success on that full moon, I would take that week, and I still do. I wasn't able to get out. It was last week, I went on the best day, I think, and it was still 2.5 foot. We went to about, 50 miles, 120, 130 foot, kind of to the southwest. I'll tell you exactly what we did. We started off at buoy number 3, which is loaded with kingfish. And there was 2 big boats out there, me and another buddy. It wasn't my boat, but I was on with Mark Feewops and another buddy of mine. And we were out there bouncing on that, and then you had a bunch of bay boats come in, like Mike's boat. And there was about 5 of them on one buoy, like they liked to fish. So we rolled on out, and we went to a wreck we had about 10 miles due west, and amberjack and barracuda, just everything was hitting. You know, it was a great morning on a full moon to catch those fish. I really didn't expect to. We did catch some mackerel, I think some kings on buoy 3, which is the green one. I don't know if y'all go there or not, but just outside of that, 100 yards from that buoy to the north is a bunch of rocks, and it holds a lot of bait right there. So in turn,
That's where we sharkfish.
Yeah.
Shark and black
I'm
grouper
sure
every Friday night.
yeah, it's going to be, and it's a big area.
Yeah.
You're not really moving in on people if you're over there. You know, you can sit, someone can sit by the buoy. We like to be about 100 yards from it, 150 yards from it. You'll see some of that debris. And then we ran on out to the south and got a good catch of the major feed was from 11 to 1, and I would say we caught most of our red grouper at that time, and about 120. Bad problem with sharks and barracudas out there.
Sharks are crazy.
If anybody's on my Facebook page and they saw the knot of line, I have a buddy of mine I call Tangles. And usually when I give you a name, you earned it. I mean, it's like no doubt who it is when I say it. Tangles had about 50 yards of line. We were trying to troll, and he wanted to set the lines. And I said, okay, you set the lines. So these are short, these are long, do it this way. So he's letting one out, and I'm watching him, and he's not really paying attention. I go, how much line you got out? And he goes, oh, I'm not sure. I said, well, what if I turn? Because, you know, if you're not staggered in some way where you know where your lines are going to cross, it can create a nightmare. You know, you don't want short lines with a long, deep line behind it, because you're going to turn and it's going to dig it and catch it. We caught 50 or 100 yards of line. I even put on the post that as a fisherman, we're out there all day, right? 12 hours, 14 hours, and you're kind of looking for a sign that says, hey, it's time to go in. That was the sign. You know, probably 100 yards of line, but we didn't get any wahoo. They're starting to show up. There's a few people catching them and showing. So if you're out there grouper fishing anywhere in 100 foot and deeper, I would suggest a flat line out back. Sometimes you can't get greenbacks or cigar minnows, which there should be plenty of them out there right now. We have them live. We call them off the Pass the Grill buoy. If anybody's familiar with the Pass the Grill buoy, it got hit in the winter and knocked down.
Not a tri stack anymore.
They put a single pole, and the hangs are to the north. So if you run in there and you're running around that buoy, you see that bait on the south side. We threw the net fine right there and caught plenty of bait.
They left the base in that tri stack.
I couldn't see it on the machine. I tried to see it, but there are hangs down there. I've been told by people buying nets from me at the store. So what I should tell you, go on that side. We just got our nets in. A lot of bait right there. If you don't have that kind of bait, don't hesitate to put a pop cork and a pinfish and send it out back on a flat line. My first sailfish was pinfish on out back.
So we do it completely different. What he's talking about is, and Steve Pappin was on the radio show not too long ago, and that's what he was talking about. The person who catches the most kingfish on charter is the one who's got the biggest live well. Because a lot of times they'll stop on the way out and they'll throw the net at the Johns Pass Bridge or the Johns Pass buoy, or if you're running out of Maximo or St. Pete like Mark does, the Pass the Grill buoy or the channel marker, and then definitely around Egmont Key, those markers. So a lot of people are stopping and getting that white bait, those threadfins, cigar minnows, and running offshore with a well full of white bait. So that way, once you get anchored up, you can have live flatline bait and live bait to chum with. And it's a great way to get that pelagic action fired up, whether it's kingfish, blackfin, tuna, wahoo, anything. But in our case, on a big party boat, no one's going to be pulling up to the bridge and throwing a cast net off the bow. So most of the time, when we go out there to set out a flat line, our first flat line, and sometimes all day, our flat lines have dead bait on. So a lot of people get hung up on that, like, oh, I couldn't catch those cigar minnows this morning, or I didn't get my thread fins. You can use a dead thread fin on a flat line and still have really good success, especially with a popping cork or a balloon, because a lot of times that current's going to take that balloon out or that flat line out, or if you're drifting, you put it on the downside side, or you got that good wind and you got a good solid anchor head, and that balloon's going to carry that dead bait away from the boat. And bouncing in the wave there, it's going to make it look like it's a live bait, even if it's a dead bait. And then through the day, you inevitably are going to catch one of those hardtails or blue runners or spot tails, ironically. Terrible, in my experience, terrible grouper and snapper bait. They work really well for pelagics for some reason. So a little bit of everything we'll use up on the surface once we start getting those baits through the day. But dead bait does work. It just is a little trickier. And I think one of the benefits we have is the number of lines in the water. So like when you're going out fishing and you're anchored up on a spot, you might have 5, 6, maybe 7 lines in the water with the captain. Whereas on a party boat, a white load's got 20, 30, 40 lines in the water, so we got a lot of smell going, so we don't have to chum as much, and a lot of times we'll have that benefit of those pelagic fish kind of coming up to the boat. I know you mentioned kingfish, wahoo, blackfin tuna, but there's been a lot of sailfish caught the last 2 or 3 weeks too, so it's that time of year where you might never see one. We had one, Captain Sal on the hub, was at the South County Reef, which is from John's Pass. You run across it basically when you're running to that number 3 marker he was talking about 9 miles, and that thing had a big sailfish sitting right on top of the reef ball. So you never know what you might run across while you're offshore right now. So not only the flat line, but I would encourage a pitch rod, because there's the slight chance of a cobia too. So having that flat line out, pitch rod ready while you're bottom fishing. Yeah, still focus on bottom fishing. That's right.
I was talking on the way over here to a friend of mine, Pete, who's somewhere around, probably near the food or something. There he is. He was grouper fishing yesterday, and I got on him on the way over here too, because it's learning, I've learned it already before, but he threw that flat line out there and never checked the drag. He put it on bait run, he stuck it in the rod holder, lazy, is what he did. He learned a lesson. It hit. It was probably, I'm assuming, a wahoo. Usually a kingfish pulls 50 yards a line. This thing just ripped line out. He reaches over, picks it up, engages it, drag too tight, can't even come out. It's going sit, bang, breaks it off. Probably, in my opinion, of course it is now that he lost it, 70-pound loss. It's all the way up here. And you know what? I've done stuff like that. I threw the frayed line out there and doubted it, and I looked at a knot, and it really didn't look right. And the one thing I can tell you is when you're out there fishing, take the time to make sure it's all right. I mean, there's been times where I've tried to tie a knot a couple times and it just ain't working. And hey, tie that for me, and get it down to make sure you don't want to lose that fish. The biggest thing about offshore fishing, the way you can become good at it is do nothing but offshore fish. Quit your job. Hours and hours and hours. But the way to cut that curve is a network. And the network I have may not be the same one y'all can have.
Definitely.
And the people that I network with are great fishermen, but they weren't 25, 30 years ago. Nobody even knew who they were. It was people that I had something in common with. And I'll tell you what's really odd about myself is most of my buddies that I fish with, I'm not hanging out with them on land. They're weirdos. The things they do that would embarrass you. They don't care. They're ruthless. But you know what? They got the same passion as I do. And where you find those people is in a group like this. All y'all have something in common. You want to learn about fishing. You enjoy fishing. It's finding the right people. When you go out there, you can't go offshore and expect to catch a bunch of fish in 4 hours. I have people that will ask me at work, hey, take me out fishing, I want to follow you. And I go, okay, come on. You can follow me in your boat. So what time are you leaving? I'll be at the dock at 5:30. 5:30, I got to do this and do that. I get out there about 9. I'm all for kids. You know, I support every event I can with a kid. But my kid's got to go to baseball practice at 3. Well, you're probably not going to go offshore and have a successful day with that type of time. Because you got to run somewhere in the neighborhood of a couple hours most of the time, unless it's winter time, where you can, get in a little closer to catch grouper and stuff. So it's like anybody that's any good at something like golf or whatever it is, they do it all the time. And that's what, to get good at fishing, you gotta, everybody wants to be the guy on Facebook with all the big fish, right? That guy ain't showing you the pictures of them days where you don't get nothing. That's when he goes back into his archives there, like this Brody over here. He'll show you something from 3 years ago. Because he's got the same look. Is that a fishing question?
Yeah, it's two different. I personally use my weight as my group weight. I do swivels on both ends. I personally like that. Me personally. What do you got? You got slides?
Do you tie the swivels, or are they made into the weight?
No, they're made into
Oh yeah, I don't use those. I use a slip sinker. The reason why I do is I leave my weight, and this is one of the most important things I can tell you about bottom fishing. Leave that weight on the bottom. It does not, if it lifts up, bam. You're lifting it up, you can see that line go bam, bam, bam.
See, that's what I said. For me, most of my bites are at the bottom, and then I'll lift the rod up, and then as I'm lifting it up, they're pulling it down. I mean, that's probably 80% of my bites.
So as far as what you're talking about, as far as the lead and having the swivel on both sides, one of the most important things I think in my mind is having a slip lead that can slip freely up and down your main line. Because the reason for that is if you have a swivel on the other side of this lead, that doesn't allow that lead to move freely on the line. So imagine this sitting on the bottom. When this is all sitting on the bottom, you've got your lead sitting still on the bottom. If a fish comes over here to this hook, he just has, can you pull that line just tighten up to feel the lead? So all this fish has to do is just barely touch that hook. And watch that rod tip. I'm just barely moving that hook. And that rod tip's bouncing and he feels everything I'm doing in that rod tip. Whereas, can you tighten it up again? Whereas if I put my finger on this side of the lead and act like it's a swivel, or you could tie it up or something, where this fish is going to have to hit that hook hard enough to disturb that 6-ounce lead to make that lead move. Whereas if it was a swivel on both ends, he's got to hit that lead hard enough to make the lead pick up off my hand or off the bottom for that rod tip to do anything. So he's got to hit that bait harder than 6 ounces to make that rod tip react. Whereas with a slip lead, just the slightest little movement of that hook, just a little bit, is making that rod tip bounce a lot. So you're basically, with a slip lead, your hook is connected to your rod tip. With a swivel on both sides of this sinker, now your rod tip's connected to this 6-ounce lead. And this lead's got to move before your rod tip will move. So most likely you're going to have more action and more bites and more success when you do reel up, because you're not going to feel the bite without reeling that lead off the bottom. Once the lead's off the bottom, then all of a sudden you can feel the bite again. Because that way your rod tip's connected to your hook. With a slip lead, you can leave it flat on the bottom. To me, the person who's going to be the most successful while near shore or deep water offshore fishing is going to be the person who can keep their bait on the bottom the longest and present it naturally, and be able to feel the lead on the bottom and feel the bite. Because what a lot of people I'll see doing is what you were just talking about, how you want to make sure that you feel the bait and don't let it just bounce on the bottom. Can you put your hand out and shoot flat falling out for me? So a lot of times I'll see someone and they're sitting on the boat and they're drinking a beer and talking to their buddy, not paying attention. Whereas if you just move your rod tip up and down as the boat bounces. Whereas if you're moving with the boat and actively fishing, I can look away and keep my line tight enough to feel the lead, but not tight enough to disturb that lead on the bottom. So his hand can keep moving like the boat's rocking. Come on, that's like a 6-inch sheet, man. So your hand up, yeah, like that. There you go.
It'd be easier on the concrete.
Well, no, I want your hand to move. Because if I disturb the lead, it's going to fall out of his hand. But I can follow that line and I moved it. But basically the idea is you want to keep the line tight enough to feel the lead, but not tight enough to disturb the lead on the bottom. Because if you're disturbing that lead on the bottom, the area we're fishing is hard bottom, but it also has sand and silt on the bottom. So every time that lead rolls on the bottom or even rolls a little bit, it creates a puff of sand. And so anything that was looking at your hook sees that puff of sand and is then scared away. So especially the bigger quality fish, that 8, 9, 10-pound mangrove, that 20-pound gag, that 15-pound red grouper, he sees a big old puff of sand because you're letting your lead bounce on the bottom. He's not going to bite. Whereas if you're able to keep that lead perfectly still and you're actively fishing, moving with the boat, dancing with the boat I call it, keeping that line tight enough to feel the lead but not disturb the lead, you're going to have the most sensitivity, you're going to be able to feel the bite the most actively, and when that fish bites, you're going to be able to put the hammer down and hook up to them really quickly. Because if you, even in a 1-foot sea, if you're just holding your rod steady and not moving that rod tip with the boat, that lead's just bouncing up and down off the bottom. You guys can hear that lead in the back even over me talking, can't you? And imagine sound travels 3 times faster underwater. So that lead bouncing up and down on that basically porous, almost hollow limestone bottom is making a ton of noise. So you really got to pay attention and what I call actively fish, and you're constantly moving the rod tip with the boat. And a lot of times, like when I drop down, I'll drop down and I'm sitting there and I might wait 60 seconds or so and I'll lift my rod tip to the sky and then slowly drop it back down to bottom. And what I'm doing is straightening out the leader, because a lot of times when you drop this down to bottom, your bait is going to be up above the lead, because your bait's going to have drag to it. Whether you're using a piece of squid, a thread fin, whatever it is, your bait has drag. So as your 6-ounce or 3-ounce or 2-ounce lead drags your bait to bottom, your bait's going to actually come up and get in line parallel to your main line. That's why it's really important to hook your bait straight so it doesn't spin. But as it goes down to bottom, it's right in line with your main line. When it hits bottom, a lot of times your bait's going to hit bottom near your lead. If the fish are really active and aggressive, it won't matter. You'll get a bite right away because they're ready to eat. If they're not active and aggressive, after about maybe a minute or two of hitting bottom, if I don't get a bite right away, I'll slowly lift my rod tip to the sky and I'll slowly set it back down to bottom. And what that does is it allows that current or the swing of the boat or the drift of the boat or whatever it may be to stretch out that leader, so that way the bait's appearing on the bottom more naturally. You get a more natural presentation. That leader's nice and stretched out. You're using a 4, 5-foot leader. It's useless unless you make sure it's stretched out and appearing natural on the bottom. So real important to kind of think like a fish and think about how your leader's laid out there. And then also make sure you're actively fishing, not letting that lead move on the bottom. And a slip lead, let me tell you, it'll change the game for you. 50% you have better feel for the bite, you have a better success rate on more quality fish. Because like if you drop a GoPro down, or you drop any sort of camera down, or you go down on a dive or whatever, you'll see a lot of times those more active fish, those aggressive fish like the white grunts, the vermilions, the porgies, they don't care. That lead can be bouncing up and down, they'll still get bites. That's why, like our 5-hour half-day trip, our shortest trip closest to shore, you can take out 60 tourists and catch 300 fish with a bite. Because they don't care. The gray snapper or the white grunt's going to bite no matter what. He's aggressive. Whereas that same trip, you can take 60 tourists out, and maybe 2 or 3 advanced anglers go, and they go to target hogfish, and they might catch 2 or 3, 4 hogfish, and everybody else is on the boat like, how are they doing that? It's because they're holding bottom. They're presenting the bait naturally, and they're making sure they don't miss those fish. So it's definitely a little bit of a trick. That experience kind of sets you apart, like what you were saying.
Yeah, I wouldn't tell everybody that on my boat. I let them learn themselves. If they want to.
That's one way to do it.
He entertains us.
Bob.
Would you shorten your leader during red snapper season? Maybe use a 5 or 6 foot during mangrove?
So In Mahoney's case, fishing on a smaller private charter most of the time with just a handful of my buddies around, no. I would still keep that 5 to 6 foot leader. But in a party boat situation, I a lot of times will think about how many lines are going down around me. So if during red snapper season, when everybody and their brother wants to get out, and their sister and their mother and their twin wants to get out on the water, and the boats are more full because it's a finite amount of time, then I would probably shorten my leader. And that's only because I'm trying to prevent tangles. If you use a 5, 6 foot leader, you got people on either side of you, you're going to have a greater chance of hooking up with our neighbors.
A lot of times they're hitting on the way down too, if you have that long leader.
Well, in a perfect world, if they're hitting on the way down, I would want a longer leader, and I would slow down the descent. So like during red snapper season, when those fish are chummed up off the bottom, the biggest fish is always going to be at the top or bottom of that water column. So if you come up on a spot and it's 150 foot deep, and that fish show starts 10, 15 foot off the bottom, and then comes all the way up to 60 foot of water, the biggest red snapper is either going to be at 60 foot or at 145 foot, at the bottom or very top of that school, general rule of thumb. So a lot of times, dropping down really slowly until you start to get that live bait really frisky and he starts freaking out, or you start getting nibbles on your dead bait, is a great way to try to target one of those bigger fish, or using the knocker rig with a super light lead on a spinning rod and a big bait. But you can't really do that super successfully on a party boat with a lot of lines in the water. Whereas if I was going out with 6 people on a 6-pack boat, or on the Flying Up 2 with 10 people on a private charter, I'd need knocker rigging off the back of the boat to catch the biggest red snapper. The biggest red snapper I've ever caught in this area was on a 44-hour private charter on the Florida during red snapper season. There were 17 people on the boat fishing, and half of them were asleep at the time. And I was on the bow of the boat with 20-pound fluorocarbon and an 8-ounce egg sinker and a thread fin, the biggest one I could find. I caught like a 21-pound red snapper. It was the most fun I've ever had. But that's knocker rigging, trying to float that bait down really slowly, and that big aggressive fish came up off the top of the school and just inhaled it. So yes and no, I would shorten my leader to answer your question, but keeping in mind that you can still slow your descent down. You still have a really good shot, because red snapper are stupid. They're very easy to catch. And they'll bite just about anything. So the biggest piece of bonita belly, bonita strips, mackerel, mullet, octopus, all great options. Dropping that down real slowly, because a lot of times, especially if you're using a big piece of bonita, it's going to get a lot of pecks at whatever's down there. It's going to love that smelly, oily bait. So you can drop it down real slowly until you start to feel those nibbles, and just put it in gear and stop there. And a lot of times you'll have a great opportunity as a big fish up in the water column. But then you've got that big 6-ounce lead, and it's going to move because you don't have bottom to stop that lead. So even if you're trying to keep the lead still, there's no way to keep that lead still up in the water column. So it's definitely not the most natural of presentations, but if they're hungry and you're targeting red snapper, they're going to eat it. What would be your answer?
Well, big fish, if I'm going to catch a big fish, most likely I'm not putting the bait in the water. I'll let everybody else get in the water. I'll watch somebody break off. To me, normally, the big fish don't hit until into the, like getting into your fishing trip. Very seldom, if I drop down on the first spot, call the biggest fish of the day. So what I usually do is let my buddies drop down, fish start feeding, somebody breaks off. I tell them to go retie, and I just step in their spot. Right? And it works. I tell them, my buddies will tell you that.
So you're selectively choosing when to drop, or when you do choose to drop, will you drop on the big bait on the bigger tackle?
Always. And I drop slow, always. When Brody asked about the double swivels, I get more twist in those than I do the slip. And I learned something tonight. Listen, I know that I don't want it banging, and I want that lure going off, but what helps that is having that rod tied to the bait, not to the weight. And it made a lot of sense, and that's what, sometimes you don't know why you do it. You learn it from other people, but that's the way you fish. I never lift a rod. I'm using circle hooks. My rod tip's in the water. And when I feel him thump, he's getting about 10 cracks. once I get him 10 or 15 times wrapped, now I'll go to pull up if I want to. But I'll bring him all the way up with the rod tip down. And just really, I got pressure on him. It's lifted some, it's not pointed at him. But it's the easiest way. You have the rod underneath your armpit and you just wind him right in. Sometimes all this, you get excited, you drop down, you got slack, you're kind of flirting with it there about him spitting it out. If you don't hold pressure the whole time, there's a good chance that hook can come out. I know with, especially your pelagics, when we fishing, you got to keep that line tight. 90% of the time, we keep the boat in gear because the angler's not going to be able to keep it tight. So we're going to keep it tight with the boat until he gets back to the corner. The boat's doing everything. That guy's just winding. But the minute you let slack go, boom, that fish is gone. Whether you're free spool, you should never mess with your drag while you got the fish on. That should have been done before you threw the rod.
I might help you a little bit.
But you brought up a good point, though. Excuse me one second. You brought up a good point about making sure that you crank before you set the hook. So often I'll see people like put 1 or 2 cranks in and they start lifting up. That does nothing. You got to crank until you can't crank anymore. And then if you're unable to gain line, so when I get a big bite, I start cranking it and I stare at my spool. And if that spool stops moving or slows down, that's when I know I have too much pressure on that fish and the reel's no longer gaining line. That's when I start to lift up because I know I have all the pressure on the fish. And then if it's a really big fish, I'll do what's called the grouper dance. At least that's what we dubbed it. And you're just doing a short pump up with your body and reeling down. And I'll do that really quickly just to gain a little bit of line. And then once that's done, and you, like you said, 10, 15 cranks off the bottom, stop. Point the rod tip at the fish, just like you were saying, keep that rod tip low and finesse it. If he wants to start digging, let him dig a little bit. Because once you get him up off the bottom, the war is won. The rest of the battle is just making sure that you don't pull that hook or let him spit that hook or all the fatigue tackle that you have now from that first 10, 15 cranks off the bottom. You don't want to stress it and break it. So it's all about finesse once you get them up off the bottom. And a lot of times, once they lose sight of the bottom, they kind of lose their fight, especially grouper. Once they kind of lose, once you got them 60, 80 feet off the bottom, they kind of chill out. A lot of times that barotrauma takes over, and then all of a sudden they're floating up to the surface, and you're just keeping pressure on the fish so you can't spit the hook.
Yeah, so going back to you when you said Dylan keeping that stuff on the ground. Here's for example, I took, my dad, he's 86 years old, and another guy's amateur and stuff like that, and he's Thomas died. So I said, I'm looking at the screen, I know there's millions of lanes down there, big time, so I said, let Rodney Holder catch him, just drop that 8-ounce thing that we were dragging, we were anchored up at that time. And they sat there, and Rodney Holder caught, 4 fish within 15 minutes.
Except for the big loss. Except for the big loss.
That's a different story. That's a different story. But dropping on there, so there was no really waves in action, so it was a little bit of bounce and stuff. So it was pretty much on the bottom. Now there's no knocker rig or anything like that. It's straight big ass jig on there.
Yeah. So
and it was sitting there with a dead sardine, with a big slap of skin on his face, and together.
And you were catching vermilions and porgies.
Oh, I said, let's do that. I brought a couple rods. Bang, bang, bang.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, we got 2 rods in there. We get those things up there, another 2 rods more. So Mr. Rodney Holden caught a fish. No one else did because no one was going like this around.
Yeah.
Just stayed on the bottom.
Yeah, so it becomes a lot less important to hold bottom and actively fish, especially when we're targeting things like vermilions, porgies. Now, it's still important because you have better sensitivity. If you're actively fishing and keeping that line tight enough to feel the lead but not disturb it, you have the best connection with the hook and you'll be able to feel those little pecks from those smaller vermilions and porgies. But a variety of fish like vermilions, porgies, white grunts, squirrelfish, some of those other smaller, more aggressive fish are less kind of afraid of those big puffs of sand. And some are even attracted by it. For example, hogfish look for that puff of sand. So a lot of times those hogfish, like the hog balls, the naked ball jigs, a lot of the ball jigs are created to cast out away from the boat as far as you can, and then just kind of twitch your wrist and let that lure kind of walk the dog back to you and create those puffs of sand. So some fish react to it and actually feed better because of it. But the quality fish, that 9, 10, 12 pound mangrove, that 10, 12, 15, 20 pound gag grouper, red grouper, they're going to be a lot more picky, a lot more leader shy. They've been around the block once or twice like old Mahoney here, so they know the deal. They're not going to be fooled by that lead bouncing up and down. I think we had a question back here first.
You're on a boat trip. How long do you have a shock leader?
The shock leader, you mean the top shot?
Yeah, top shot.
Yep, top shot, shock leader, different terms. I mean, me personally, on a lot of my rods that you'll see over here, I have braided line in those high gear ratio reels, because a lot of times I'll be out there in 200, 300, 400 foot of water, because I like doing a lot of the deep water stuff that Mike's talking about. But you don't need braid. 90% of applications for 100 or 95% of anglers, mono works great. Like if you look over here, my big rod has got all mono in it. I don't want to hook an amberjack with braided line. Trust me, it's terrible. And even big gag grouper fishing, mono's great. It's really when I'm mangrove snapper fishing in deep water where I need that extra sensitivity, where braid becomes important, or you're slow pitch jigging, or you're knocker rigging, or using that lighter tackle where sensitivity becomes important. But if you're using a really good quality rod like those Bull Bay rods or some nice custom rods, you don't need monofilament to really feel that bite, or braided line to really feel that bite. Mono works fine. But to answer your question, if you are using braid, I like, my general rule of thumb is about a third of your line in the water should be monofilament. If you're not as experienced, maybe start at like 2/3, especially because during a trip that top shot gets smaller and smaller as you get pulled in the bottom or it just gets worn out. You always cut a little piece off your top shot. You don't want to try to do that line to line out on the boat. It's a lot more difficult. So I always like starting with this longer top shot that you can trim down through the course of a trip, especially like a 39 hour. I always add some line to my top shot longer than I want to start, because by the end of the trip it'll be nice and short. And I don't want to have to retie it on the boat. So top shot, you want to keep it longer than you need to start, and kind of get comfortable with it. Once you get experience, you can shorten the top shot up. But the goal is to make sure that you're always, if you do get tangled, you're tangled mono to mono. And even the best, most experienced anglers get tangled a lot, or get tangled occasionally, especially like if we're fishing down the side of a boat and you got 15, 20 people lined up, and this guy in the back hooks an 80-pound amberjack, or a 50-pound wahoo, or whatever it might be, a big, big trophy fish. Unless you're paying attention, you're going to get tangled up. But if you're paying attention and you see all of a sudden this line's bowed over, and you hear the drag screaming, and the guy's moving up the side of the boat, the line's working towards your way, reel up and get out of the way. It drives me crazy when I see that a lot on a party boat where someone's just like, whoa, he's got a big fish. And oh, there's the line coming right up the side of the boat. Oh, that's a big one. It's like, dude, reel up, get out of the way. And I understand people are like, well, I paid for this trip. I'm going to catch my fish. I'm going to get my fishing time. But if you don't reel up and you don't get out of the way, you're going to get tangled and you're going to lose more fishing time. So especially if you're using braid, you got to really be paying attention. You got to be actively fishing, watching the people around you, and be courteous. If someone's got a fish moving up the side of the boat, reel up and get out of the way. So if it's not an issue, you're using a top shot, braided line is fine. But if it becomes an issue, you're not paying attention, it starts to create problems, that's when it's a bigger problem. Do you use braided line?
Offshore, I use, I make for mangoes or something like that, but you gotta have the give. I got, Tommy Rollins took me to school one day. We were out in the middle grounds on the back side of it. It's supposed to be a lot of big gags in there, and had beautiful pinfish, and I had my $700 combo, high speed accurate, 200-pound rod that's as big as a pencil, which to me now I look at it like that's just Mickey Mouse. I mean, I sell it, but it's really not going to put a 30-pounder in the boat. Every time I broke off 2 times in a row, shattered. my floor carbon. I had too much torque on it, which I guess you could back off of it, but then you're chancing him getting in a rock or a hole. Boat drops. Tommy put a 30 and a 32-pound gag in the boat. I came in with a broken leader. So I switched at that point to nothing more than 6-aught high speed with a 100-pound test and broomstick, solid glass. Set it on the gun if you have to, and just winch him in. You know, in most cases, the rod fights the fish. The reel just stores the line. But we've gotten into some of these reels that have 40-something pounds of drag, high speed, where they have become like a winch. But like that big one he's got there, that would be my pick if we were on Big Grouper. He's probably got stuff over there that maybe worth, you know, $1,000 for the combo. I'm still picking that $200 combo right there to catch big gags with, because you got to have that give. The top shot I use on some of those accurates that I use when I'm, you know, if you're catching 10 or 15 pound red grouper, you know, like we did the other day, I'll use that accurate with braid, but I still got 100 feet of mono on it. I still want that give, because I'm hoping that I'm going to get something that not everybody's going to get, you know, whether it be a Cabrera or, you know, just something different is what I'm out there fishing for, you know, usually.
So he kind of alluded to it earlier when he said you don't drop down right away. He kind of sits back, watches everybody. When someone breaks off, that's when he pulls out the broomstick with the bigger bait, the 100-pound leader. And that's kind of what my dad does too. He's less interested in trying to catch quantity
Being first.
Being first. He wants to catch the quality fish. And he always seems to when we go fishing, because he's soaking that bigger bait with that 100 or 125 pound. And lately, he's gotten so bad, he uses an electric reel. It sits there with a 125 pound leader and a huge piece of bait. And when he hooks up, he catches his fish. And he always catches the bigger fish when we go. And I'll catch more mangroves and porgies and vermilions and some nice grouper, but he always gets the big one. And that's why he's selectively picking those bigger baits and using that heavier tackle. And the heavier tackle, the heavier the leader, the bigger the hook for the bigger piece of bait, you're selecting that bigger fish. You're not going to get as many bites, you're not going to get as many fish, but if the big boy's out there and he happens to bite, you're going to have a much greater shot at catching that fish. And so what you were saying earlier is so true. A lot of times people will come out there and they've got that high dollar, like this is a slow pitch jigging rod, but it's kind of the same idea. That high dollar rod that's super sensitive, got a great backbone to it, and a super expensive nice reel with plenty of drag, but it's no substitute for that big winch, that 9-knot with the reel I got from the pawn shop on a big broomstick rod, because that thing you can put on the rail and it can take abuse. And a lot of times, like I said before, you reel down until you can't reel anymore. That reel isn't gaining line anymore. It's exactly the rod is fighting the fish at that point. And the only thing you can do is try to lift up. But sometimes you get that big fish, you can't lift up. The only thing you can do is use physics and use the side of the boat as a lever and drop that rod to the side of the boat, and then use the lever action and kind of drop to one knee and pull that fish up. That's why all our offshore rods that we use have a longer foregrip. So I purposely had extra foregrip added, so that way we have more foam in the foregrip in front of the reel. So if you need to, you have foam to drop on the rail, because you never want to let the glass touch the rail. Always want to make sure the foam's there. And some people will even use the pool noodles and stuff like that. I think that's kind of silly in my opinion, but people like it, it's comfortable, whatever. But I like using just the foam of the rod and putting that on there, especially with the bigger rods. If you're fishing on a smaller boat like a center console, you could just put one knee up on the rail and then use your leg as that lever. Whereas on a party boat or a Coast Guard inspected boat, you got that nice metal rail, perfect height to drop to one knee and use as a lever. So you got to just kind of think, and that's why to me, People ask me all the time, well, I've got this spinning reel, it's got 60-pound drag, I can't catch a grouper with it? What would be your answer to that?
I mean, you can catch one on anything, but it's not what I would want to use.
Yeah, because you don't have the physical strength.
When you look, you can have the smallest guy on the boat catch the same grouper as you do. You are wore out, and he's not. I mean, I've had football players on the boat that are just out of gas on 20-pound tunas because they're trying to use too much arms. You know, when he's talking about putting his foot up, and you got the rod under here, your whole body's got leverage there. It's not just this, and that's why that little guy Tommy can bring up a 30-something pound gag without really making a bunch of noise. And that's, I'll be honest with you, when I hook up on the boat, and people that'll fish with me will tell you, I don't make a noise. I don't even want you to know. I want to get you in the boat, get enough bait on, drop you down where you don't get in my spot. And what happens to most people, they hoot and holler, the whole boat's looking at them, they get the fish up and start taking pictures. That's when I'm going back to the same spot you just called me from. There is no, when you're on the boat, it's fair game, right? You can't be in the same spot. Maybe not his boat.
Who fishing with the wrong crowd?
They'll do it to me in a second. If I try to tie a knot there, my spot doesn't go.
And it's, in my opinion, there's not one spot that's better than any other on any boat. It doesn't matter. But there is a rule of thumb, and I strongly believe if me and Mike are fishing next to each other and the rest of the boat, maybe it's their fifth or sixth trip, they don't have a lot of experience, the area around me and Mike is typically going to be a better place to fish because we're not missing the bite as much. We're going to have a tendency to hook up more, and as we're bringing those fish up, they're regurgitating baits because of that barotrauma. So they get 20, 30 feet off the bottom, and all of a sudden, everything that was in their stomach is now spit up in the water column. So all of a sudden, 10, 15 fish in, that area that we're fishing has all of a sudden created a natural chum slip. And now that's the hot spot. So there's not one spot better than any other on the boat, but you get 5 or 6 or 7 experienced anglers in a row and everybody else isn't quite as experienced, that's the best place to fish. And if you go on any party boats, a review site, anywhere across the country or the world, there's always at least a couple reviews. Well, the captain put his friends at the front of the boat or the back of the boat on the fish. The rest of the boat didn't catch any. We couldn't catch any, but the captain's friends in the front caught all the fish. The best captain in the world can't put his buddies on the front of the boat on the fish every time, the rest of the boat not on the fish. Don't care what you're told. It's just because that happens to be the area of that boat where the experienced anglers are fishing. And it creates that chum slip.
Well, and you don't let them know where you want to go. You know what I mean? When I go deer hunting, right, we got 20 stands, and they all want to know where I'm going. I don't know where I'm going, y'all pick first. Because then it's like you pick what's left. They don't know if that's what you want, because buddies will come in behind you every time. Now, mine have gotten smart enough just to watch me, and they know what to do. And now they're starting to kind of do the same thing. When you're on a boat, the boat's got 50 spots, even a 20-footer, 30-footer, all down the side. Let the people go out there first. Once in a while, say, man, I ain't got a hit. Make them think you're sitting in the worst spot. You may not be.
I always try to go to the front personally. That way I have the bow to work, and everybody generally likes to go to the back of the boat. So I always go to the front.
Yeah, quick question. Getting back to grouper fishing. Have y'all heard, or is it true or folklore about if you lose a big grouper, that chances are that they can go down and bark or something like that and fight off?
It's almost all the species we target. All those species that we target, it's just like an animal in the woods. I mean, I don't know as much about hunting, so I'm not going to say that because I'll probably look stupid in front of Mike. But you injure an animal, he's gonna react, and that sound that's emitted, all the other animals know what's up. And a gag grouper, some of the porgy species, a lot of different species will emit that, but especially a big gag. They go down there and they start doing that grunt, And a lot of the species, red grouper, gag grouper, almost all groups per species, when they start to get into their hole and they feel agitated, they flare their gills. And you go swimming, diving, and you dive down on that ledge and stick your head in the face of the ledge, that big gag that's in there instantly flares his gills. And that's their sign of aggression, but it also helps them wedge themselves in their hole harder to pull them out. And when they're doing that, they're sitting there grunting. So even if you get him out of the rock, if he was rocked up at all, he was in there grunting, making a lot of noise. And if the fish are picky at all, they can shut down a bite really quick.
I've noticed some of the guys I fish with here, they put too big a bait on some light tack, then they get, a grouper on or something like that, and I lose it or shuts the bite down. I say, hey, that's what happens. You do big bait, small ride.
Yeah.
You weren't prepared for that.
Well, even catching one and letting you go, I mean, I'm not going to tell you to do, I'm not going to tell you what I do, because it may not be right. But I've been with a commercial guy years ago who would throw them grouper in the back of the boat because it was self-bailing, and water would always be in there, and all of them lived, and he would not release them grouper back, the short ones, until he was done fishing that spot. I don't recommend that.
Don't do that.
You got a problem with sharks, and you got a shark in that spot. He ain't going to be there. You go to the next spot, it'll be there. We got a real problem with sharks.
Big problem, sure.
They put a moratorium on or whatever. You can't kill them. Now we got way too many. Big ones too. I mean,
They're starting to try.
I don't go to the beach. I don't go to no lakes in Florida. Basketball County.
Hang on one second. He's had his hand up for a minute. We'll get to you.
So while you're doing flat lines on the console, because I know there's some black that are moving in, should you run the wire because there's a lot of kings mixed in, or just look dangerously go fluoro and hope you won't use it? Or just keep feeding?
You know, if you're targeting a tuna, I would say go mono.
Okay.
But I've had tuna hit wire. I think this time of year, you're more likely to get like a wahoo, or a tuna, or a sailfish. A sailfish and a tuna may not hit the wire quick. Even if it's a short piece. But for tuna, I would never use it. I was strictly fishing for tuna. We fish for yellowfin in the northern Gulf, and all we use is the line coming off the rod tied to a circle.
Not even a top shot, not even a lead or nothing.
No grade, 60-pound test, 40-pound test.
The tuna have big eyes, and the reason for that is they're fishing deep a lot of times. They're swimming deep and they're eating squid during the daytime. So the tuna have incredible eyesight. So if you're targeting tuna, you see tuna around, or you know the tuna's in the area, I'd be using like 50-pound fluorocarbon for leader, no grade. But this time of year, if I was going to set out a static flat line, it's always going to have a wire on it. Because in my case, I want to catch whatever's swimming by the boat. A bent rod is a good one, So a wire is going to be more commonly used because we have more mackerel, we have more kingfish around right now. And you can still catch a tuna or a sailfish on wire. It does happen. But definitely, if there's a big school of tuna, I'd be reaching for a rod without wire.
I learned this from a friend of mine many, many years ago. When you got a grouper, long up in the rocks, I just want to get your definition. Yeah, grouper got in the rocks, and I reeled up tight. He said, now what are you going to do? I don't got where it's going to come out. He said, reel it tight, as tight as you can, start thumbing that frame. Thumb, thumb, thumb. With about 5 or 6 times, that fish was out of the hole.
Yeah, so that's called playing the game. What's your approach?
That's the first thing I'm going to do. But most likely he went in head first, flared his gills. And they got that serrated edge that kind of holds them in there, but you ain't pulling them out. I'll thumb it like that a little bit, and then if he doesn't come out right away, I just give him slack and wait. He will come out there. It's just know when you see that line moving, you got to start winding before you ever lift.
I didn't know. He knew.
It works. I've done it. Yeah, I've done it.
Yeah, so when you get a grouper hung up in the rocks, to me there's 3 methods. There's reel down tight banjo, there's get it total slack and then just randomly start cranking like a madman and giving them kind of slack and then pressure, slack and then pressure, because they'll try to jump out when they feel that slack or going completely slack. But like he said, my favorite method is when I get hung up in the rocks, reel down while you're still got that pressure on the fish, banjo it like you were talking about, strumming the line as hard as you can. Another good reason that you want to have mono, because it's hard to do a braid, and you don't get the twang in the braid, if you will. So the mono definitely helps to do the banjo. And then, like you said, I slack off. After I do that a couple times, I'll slack off and wait for it to start moving or you feel anything. And when I slack off, I do the same thing as if I'm actively bottom fishing, trying to keep that line tight. You just feel a little bit of pressure, because if you feel him start to wiggle, he's readjusting. And a lot of times, as soon as he closes those gills to readjust, you can yank him out of there. So I keep it just tight enough to where I can feel it, so that way I can put the pressure on as soon as I feel him start to wiggle. Because grouper are smart. A lot of times, like when you see that guy land that, or that girl land that 30-pound fish, that 30-pound gag on 40-pound test, it's because they got lucky. And that's not an offense to anybody, but a lot of times when you catch a big gag on light tackle, it's because you hooked that gag where he was away from his rock. Because especially a big gag, a true black, they're extremely territorial, kind of more apex, top of the food chain animals. And they have a specific rock or a specific hole or a specific part of the ledge that's theirs. And so they're going to run back to their part of that ledge. So if you hook him because you were able to drag him out of his ledge because he was wondering what's going on the other side of the ledge, and let's say you hooked him on the top of the ledge 20 yards from the spot, he gets hooked up. It's loud. He gets hooked up, and it's very difficult for him to get back to his spot. So you're going to have a greater chance of getting that fish up off the bottom without him rocking up. Whereas if you hook him right next to his spot, he goes in that rock, and he's gone. He's going to break off.
A lot of those, I'm sure I don't like does it, but I dive a lot of these spots, and there's lots of fishing. All are not all big. It looks like the size of a big swimming pool with like a hole in the ground. It's got like a little underprop. And all those big blacks, I mean, when we dive down on your way down, you'll see the spot. Round spot, you can see it's 6 by 6, whatever. You get down there, all the bigger fish are on individual holes outside of the big swimming pool.
Just all
And they're all just, they sit around this, right around the top. All the big red snaps are on the bottom, right at the hole. All the little ones are up top. And all the blacks and all the big gags are all right outside of the big swimming pool. And we come across legends, but most of the spots out there are all single holes.
What do y'all do when you shoot one who's not big enough?
They're all big enough. I'll be honest with you, I haven't seen a black grouper. I personally have never seen one down in the Keys. I know that Joe over there is in the Keys. They have a lot of juveniles. We don't really see a lot of
Caught
juveniles.
one out here was the fall. I mean, trolling. He's probably 10, 12 pounds. Trolling stretch 30 in that 30, 40 foot water. I've got one. And all the hours.
Exactly. I mean, the ones we're shooting over 100 pounds, up to 110 pounds. I mean, most of them are large, and we don't really see the juveniles, but there's a lot of big ones. I mean, there's a ton of them.
And the reason you're getting those 100-pounders is because you're fishing that small, flat pothole in deep water. Those are the last secrets out there, because that big pothole isn't easily spotted on that Garmin relief shading map. And it's flat, and there's not a lot of relief to it, and if you're running fast over it, you don't see it on your bottom machine. The middle grounds, the elbow, any 3, 4, 5 foot break out there, everybody's got it. And if they don't got it, you buy the $300 Garmin relief shading chip, and now you got it. There's not a lot of secrets left out there, but the deep water, 180 to 300 foot potholes, those are the golden nuggets that are still left out there.
And everything south. I mean, I do a lot of fishing south, Sarasota. So
That's
most of
what
them out there are potholes. You know, that anything outside of 140 is all pot. I mean, you'll come across legends, and very seldom. You know,
Well, and looking at the bottom machine, that was fishing with a commercial guy. And you're always thinking, grouper, that you want to see that big relief, the big drop off. Well, like he's saying, we fish a lot south, and what you're actually looking for is what's under the bottom. You know, you're not looking, you got two lines on your bottom machine, right? The top line.
This is 102. I don't know if we're ready for this in this class.
What I look for on that machine, and he told me this, and it works, when it starts going down, you see a long blue line. He said, that's your red grouper. He's in the rock. He's in the hole, limestone, like he was saying. That's what we got. And Tommy taught me that, and I can tell you, when you start to see it change.
This is like when you give away the inshore fisherman's spot. I'm like,
Well, that's it. I'm not a guy. I give them all away. Maybe I'll one day I'll take. We had a radio show a couple weeks ago, springtime snook fishing. I gave every spot on that radio show that I know. And I'm telling you, I caught monster snook there.
Moving on.
Switching to grades, you first people home, some people put squid in the water, put stick in the water, dead bait and all that, and other people put a lot of pinfish and something.
I'm stink. I get the stink out, whatever it is. I'm going to put dead bait. There's no way I learned my lesson. You don't start off with pinfish line, in my opinion. Drop the dead stuff down like he's been talking about. It becomes a chum slip down there.
On a charter, what I do, and he's right, you want to get the smell going in the water. So if you got 8 people on the back deck of your charter boat and you pull up to a spot, I'm going to give the kids, the less experienced anglers, the dead bait, the squid, the cut thread fins, do a mix, maybe more squid than thread fins if I'm fishing shallower, more thread fins than squid if I'm fishing deeper. But then the grandpa, the dad, the wife, I'm going to break off one really nice frisky live bait. And you put a mix down there, because a lot of times when you first get on a spot, the biggest fish, generally in my experience, the biggest fish is either going to hit very first or very last. That big aggressive fish is going to be like, oh yeah, it's dinner time, I'm going to eat first, I'm going to jump in the front of the line. Or he's going to hang back and kind of survey the situation, and if you present your baits naturally, hold bottom, you might get an opportunity to get him to bite later in the spot, once the smell starts going in the water. So a lot of times, the very start of the spot, the very end of the spot, that big frisky live bait, that slow pitch jig, that big piece of dead bait's gonna be what entices that big fish to bite. But definitely starting all live bait on spot's not a good idea.
Does anybody show the bottom here and, less than 100 foot of water?
I don't.
Yeah, we drop them down. You know, a lot of times you get sharks. You got to really be careful right now with chumming anyway, because you're going to bring the sharks in and they'll follow you all day. It's going to be a nightmare. See, I think a little differently about that big fish. I don't think that big fish will ever eat first. I've never seen it eat first. Maybe once or twice, but
I will show you Thursday if the weather's better.
it's almost like this. If you were going to do a buffet,
I'll be at the front of the
I ain't gonna be I ain't gonna be nowhere near him. You know what I mean? Big boy's gonna go, oh, what's all the commotion about? It's a buffet. And the little guy gets in there and eats right away. And I think that's what fish do sometimes. That chum slip, they see all those fish bouncing around. And they go, oh, what's going on over there? And they come out of that hole. Nobody wants to be around them. They're too big. They're afraid they're going to get eaten. You know, it's like hanging out with him and Mike all day. Them guys, you know what I mean? So that's what I think. You know, the biggest thing is none of us know. We've had success different ways. He tells you the way he had success. I'm sitting here thinking, I ain't never had it that way. And he probably thinks the same way. We think we get them figured out. And that's when they throw you for a loop.
That's the best part about fishing.
Yeah, hunting too.
When you're fishing out deep on the party boat, what leader do you like to run? Because I know in Tampa Bay there's this huge movement of going light. I get it, if you hook 10 fish and land 2 versus you hook 2 and lose 1. I mean 2 versus 1, but obviously if you're using 25 liters, the chance you're going to break off versus 250.
Yeah, so the lighter the leader. Yeah, the lighter the leader, the more chances of hookups you're going to have, the more action you're going to have. I remember when I was younger fishing on our what was then a 32-hour trip. now it's a 39-hour trip. The trip has slowly gotten longer as we slow the boats down to conserve fuel. As fuel prices changed and just the trips changed. But when I was out there fishing at a young age, the captain at the time would literally come up behind you and cut your line if you're using too light a tackle. And that was the difference between like pre-TripAdvisor and post-TripAdvisor, you know? But you literally had to use a certain amount of line, and if you didn't, you weren't allowed to fish. Whereas nowadays, we kind of give a general rule of thumb, but if everybody's using 80-pound test, you're going to have a really good shot at hooking up with 80-pound test. What happens is on a party boat, like on a 39-hour trip, you'll have 30 to 40 guys out there fishing, and everybody can drop down an 80-pound test, and then one guy in the back's using 40. He's going to be stroking the mangroves. And everybody's going to be like, what's he doing? It's light a tackle. And then everybody's going to drop down a 40-pound test, and then all of a sudden the next spot, gags are going to start chewing, and everybody breaks off. The bite shuts down, and you don't catch any gags that trip. So it really comes down to balancing it out. To me, I like starting a little heavier and then working my way down if I have to. So like on a 39-hour trip, if gags are closed at night, we're going to be targeting mangroves. So I'm going to start with 40, 50-pound test. If gags are open at night targeting mangroves, I might start with 60-pound test. If I'm not really getting a bite, I might drop to 50 and might drop to 40 if I see someone else catching them faster than me. Whereas during the day, when we're not targeting mangroves as much, and we're targeting more of those red grouper, red snapper, especially if gags are open, I'm going to start at 80, might work my way down. And then if I'm catching fish, I'd stay right at 80. But if I'm going to drop down a big live bait or a big dead bait, I'm going to switch right to that 9-out with a 125-pound test. So it kind of depends on what you're targeting, the depth of water, and what's open. If gags are open, I'm always going to be using heavier tackle. Because elephants do occasionally eat peanuts, and you want a chance to land that fish. So it depends, but I don't know what.
I start way. I use a piece of cable if I have to. Drop from there. And I'm not catching them, just like he said. I'm going to start reducing, especially if somebody on the boat's catching fish and I'm not. I'll look at their tackle and look at what they're using. You know, like I said before, most fishermen, I'm out there, I'm not a guide, so I'm out there with my buddies, and they ain't want to give up much information. You know, they'll let you know that night when you get back on what you did wrong. They ain't going to help you out there every day. It's every man for himself. Even though we split fish, you know, it's one of the things we do on our boat. If there's 4 of us there, whatever we catch, you split 4 ways. It's the only fair way to do it. But I've used, we use cable on wahoo. And if somebody's catching wahoo in the area and we didn't, we'll drop that cable and we'll go to single strand wire that's 120 pounds. You know, keep going smaller until you get the fish to bite. But in my opinion, never go light unless you have to. You know, I want to see the fish. You know, Mike tries that sometimes when you snip fish with him. You don't want you taking the fish up. You mentioned guys like to pet them and name them. I like to eat them. So I'm going to start out with 80-pound test snook fishing. I don't care. If they're hitting, that's what I'm using.
And in my experience, what's changed a lot in just my lifetime is as regulations increase and more fish start to close and you see this effort shift to other species, everybody's got lighter. Like 10, 15 years ago, you went on a 39-hour, if you showed up with one of those slow pitch jigging rods or a spinning rod, you'd be laughed off the boat. Brutalized. Whereas nowadays, everybody's got 2 spinning rods and 4 slow pitch jigging rods and rods skinnier than my pinky going to fish 200 foot of water. And I've seen that shift over the last decade of as fisheries kind of restrict and we have less gag grouper season, we have less red snapper season, people are shifting and all of a sudden catching a mangrove snapper on a 20-pound class rod with 30-pound, 40-pound leader and a 4-out hook in 200 foot of water becomes really, really cool and sporty. And that's been the big shift that I've seen. Is back then, no one used that type of tackle. It was always 60, 80-pound test. The lightest line you would take out there is 60-pound, whereas now, regularly, you see people dropping down to 20, 30-pound tests during the day when the bite slows down in 200, 250, 300 foot of water. And that's just to get that bite going. So it depends on your application, but to answer your question, it's never ending. On a 39-hour trip, me personally, I would take anywhere from 30-pound test up to 200-pound test. And I would be using mostly at night anywhere from 40 to 60 pound, and during the day anywhere from 60 to 125, 150 pound. Any other questions?
Hey Dylan, why don't you explain to the people, being an offshore fisherman myself, how we return fish that are undersized?
Yeah, that's definitely important.
Other than Mike Mahoney, who doesn't fish charges.
So that's exactly what you don't want to do. And
Dylan and I have to do it.
That used to work, and it still does work. If you flip that fish 20 feet in the air and it slaps the water, it's going to swim down out of sight. But what happened is you just ruptured its swim bladder or its internal organs, and the reason it was able to swim down is its internal organs just burst. Okay. He doesn't do that. He was just telling what his friend does. All right. So and then other people, I've even seen it with our crew members. Most recently, we hired a new guy. I'm watching one of the YouTube videos, and I see him slap one of the fish on the surface. Wanted to reach through the computer screen and strangle him. And that's also a misconception, because it can do the same thing. You slap it on the surface, and people are like, oh, it scares them into swimming down. No, it doesn't. It ruptures their internal organs. Or their stomach gets pushed against their teeth and it ruptures. So you're basically venting the fish by bursting its internal organs. So you've got to make sure, if you're fishing in an area where barotrauma is occurring, especially if water is warm, you got to make sure that you're releasing that fish carefully, whether it's venting the fish underneath the base of its pectoral fin, or using a descending device like a sequelizer or something like that. It's really, really important to make sure we're returning those fish right, because so many people are out there fishing. If we're all out there fishing in 120, 200, 300 foot of water, and you're not taking care of those fish, we're never going to have access to these fish. The number of discards, the word discard is like the hot button issue if you go to a federal fisheries meeting right now. And right now we're facing issues with red grouper, gag grouper, amberjack. They're in a big fight. They're about to start. The commercial sector, the commercial lobby is about to start suing over that recent reallocation of red grouper. And dude, the discard numbers in recreational fishing is incredible. So like the total ACL, or allowable catch limit, for red grouper total is like, I think it was up to, at the highest point in the recent history, like 14 million. The number of discarded fish is almost 10 million pounds. And if those fish are being slapped down, thrown up in the air, that means we're literally releasing dead more fish than we're catching and harvesting, according to those numbers. Now, the whole validity of that's a whole different discussion, but according to the statistics they have, that's a big, big issue. So we got to work as recreational anglers to make sure people aren't throwing those fish up in the air, to make sure people are taking care of those fish, because we're going to see a big fight coming down the pipe of they aren't accountable, there's too many of them, they discard too many fish dead. We need that allocation. And the allocation fights, as far as who gets how many pounds and who gets what percentage, is going to get tougher and tougher and more cutthroat. And that, to the other side of things, the recreational fishermen in general, that's the problem. Data collection being poor, and discards, the number of discards, and our discard mortality rate, the number of fish you throw back that are dead. My big issue that I have is this guy's inshore fishing, and before he takes that trout out for a photo, he's wetting his hands down and he's cradling it and holding his breath before he takes it out of the water. And that same person will go offshore and take a big old photo with that 20-pound red snapper with 10 dead red snapper floating behind him. Like, look what I caught! I discarded 10 so I could keep this one, and they're all dead floating behind me in the photo, but yeah, I did great. But that trout I caught yesterday, I held my breath and wet my hands and made sure it got back safely. It's like, all right, so you catch and release fish inshore, and you're so careful inshore, but then you go offshore, and you high grade, you throw away keeper fish to try to keep that one really big fish, and you don't vent or descend any of your fish. You just let them float off dead to feed sharks. The mentality is so disconnected between inshore game fishing and offshore. Like that inshore fisherman that's like, I don't want to kill snook, redfish, and trout. I only catch and release. I go offshore to kill fish. I've literally heard people say that to me with a straight face, and it makes me want to punch them in the face. It's like, what's the difference?
Well, what they've done too is they've got us to where, first of all, we all know, I'm all for commercial fishing and recreational. We all know the bycatch from commercial. I've been out there south and seen those long line boats past 20 foot of water, deplete everything. Recreational ain't doing that. I was just kidding about the other thing out here. Well, the way I do it is I vent him, and he's going to pull out of my hand. Whether it's a snook, a redfish, a trout, a grouper, a red snapper, I'm going to vent him, I'm going to put him in the water, move him back and forth. Could be a marlin. He's going to snatch out of my hand. If he can't get out of my hand, I ain't letting him go. And that's usually what I do, either around the tail, if he's straight up and down, if he's really, they'll sometimes roll on their sides. So I'll have both hands doing that. And then I get to the one hand, he's going to snatch out of my hand before I let him go. I think it's the best way to do it.
Yeah, you're close to the water, that works. Yeah. On a party boat, you're higher off the water. A descending device is the best bet. Yeah. Making sure that fish can go back down. Yeah, descending device. So like a sequelizer. So you can clip these on the lip of the fish, and then once it gets to a preset depth, you can set the depth on the back of this. It releases automatically under pressure. And you attach this to a main line with a sash weight, like a 3 to 5 pound sash weight. And to answer whatever question was coming, yes, there's actually a law now, the Descend Act that was passed. You have to have either a descending device or a venting tool rigged and ready while offshore fishing in federal waters for reef fish. So if you get stopped and you're offshore in federal waters and you're fishing for reef fish and you got grouper on the boat or snapper on the boat and you don't have a descending device or a venting tool rigged and ready, which good luck with that definition. It just depends on what officer boards you that day and how he's feeling as to the definition of rigged and ready. I've asked 10 different officers and got 10 different answers on that one. So you want to make sure it's on deck somewhere readily accessible, basically. And that is the law. And the unfortunate part is some people don't know how to use that venting tool properly. They mandated venting tools like 10, 12 years ago, and they had to repeal it because a venting tool works really well in the hands of an experienced angler that's venting properly in the proper place. But what they did was they passed this law and made venting mandatory, and then they were like, wait a minute, I wonder if this works. And there was a study done, and they gave venting tools out to a bunch of different people, and they're like, show us where to vent that fish. And people are like stabbing it in the head and the eyeballs and the throat, and no one knew where to vent it. And they actually discovered that venting was killing more fish than it was saving because of improper venting. Please, if you ever see someone vent a fish by sticking something sharp in that protruding object out of their mouth, that's their stomach. So if that's punctured, that fish will go down, it'll swim away, but it'll get an infection and it won't be able to eat properly and it will slowly starve and die. So please, if you ever see someone venting fish by, sticking my bubble blade in the throat of this fish, that is totally improper, and almost every fish you release is going to die. You gotta vent that fish in the side underneath the pectoral fin. And my last thing on this is returnemright.org. So returnemright.org. It's a website that's run from the BP oil spill money, and there's $30 million floating around the Gulf of Mexico to give you guys free descending devices. You can get 2 free descending devices, like $125, absolutely free. All you have to do is go to returnemright.org and you join this little educational module. It takes like 15 minutes to go through, teaches you about where to vent, how to use a descending device, more about barotrauma and barotrauma mitigation. Once you graduate from the 10-15 minute module, you put in your mailing address and they send you like $125 in free stuff.
How did they start sending them out?
To recreational anglers, they're launching that this month. The goal is to have these in your hand before June 1st. Yeah. Any other questions? What?
Say the site again.
Return EM. Return them right. So returnemright.org. And you can always message me on Facebook or whatever, and I can send you the link too. Cut us off? Yep.
Those two guys, I'm telling you, you can pick their brain for hours and hours and hours, and they would teach you and teach you and teach you. Two of the best guys on the planet and just phenomenal fishermen. So, again, big round for Dylan Hubbard.
See you guys. Have a good night.